And so they went back to some of the vendors and said, we need to have a different invoice file come from you. This is what it needs to look like. Well, you can't do that with 50, 60,000 vendors, but you can do it with 100 vendors or 200 vendors. And that made a significant difference in their KPIs by bringing those organizations along. And they could see it because they were tracking it at a vendor level.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our #1 priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. The large companies that are present in more than 10 countries and have more than 50,000 employees need operational efficiencies at a different scale. The efficiencies at the plant or at the entity level are no longer enough. You need to figure out the shared services model where the lower cost services can be provided by the countries where the costs are likely to be lower, but managing this process requires changes in the systems and processes. You need to share data across the entities and have a shared vision for the entire organization. But executing it is far more difficult than you would think. So, how to implement shared services in larger organization? In today's episode, our guest, Brian G Shannon, shares his insights into the importance of centralizing shared services for large global rollouts. He also talks about several KPIs such as cycle time and how to measure them to ensure the data quality you expect from your financial processes. Finally, he provides insights into prioritizing the rollouts where multiple countries may be involved with the ERP deployments, along with setting the vision for the team. Let me introduce Brian to you. Brian has 25 plus years in finance process re-engineering and optimization with a particular focus on near cash touchpoints, AR, AP, and alignment with supply chain accounting processes. He has executed over 50 projects with large multinational Fortune 1000 organizations, resulting in significant ROI and cost savings for these companies. Over the course of his career, in the capacity of principal consultant, project and program manager, executive sponsor, and steering committee chair, and with extensive vertical engagement such as automotive, healthcare or pharma, food and beverage, manufacturing, chemical, defense, and public sector. He is presently the Chief Experience Officer at Gain, where he provides strategic and operational guidance to organizations going through a digital finance transformation journey, requiring some leadership alignment for change initiatives and process and technology awareness for multinational organizations. With that, let's get to the conversation. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you.
And I am super excited to have you because the kind of experience that you bring to the table, the complexity of these ERP and the finance transformation rollout, it's going to be so fascinating. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus, Brian?
Sure. So my personal story. Grew up in Canada. I'm Canadian. I'm a recovering national credit manager. Did that for a few years and then got into a project back in the 1990s, if you believe it or not,
Yeah.
actually delivering finance type of solutions through SAP for manufacturing organization, and have played a primary functional and leadership role in many projects, from the initial vision setting through the sales response process,
Yeah.
process design, best practice application, all the way through the project lifecycle, go live support, things like that. My focus is near cash processes, which would be accounts receivable, accounts payable, and then those affecting general ledger type of transactions. Over the course of my career, I've played a lead role in several executive level sponsorships of projects with Fortune 500 companies, and had led a North American fintech organization over the last number of years. We sold the company last year, and so now I'm starting fresh with something new that gives me an opportunity to share my experience and expertise a little differently.
It's cool, and it's going to be so much fun to learn from those experiences. And obviously, the engagements that you led were slightly larger, in scale, and we can always learn from these opportunities. My listeners are going to be SMB, but there are some enterprise listeners as well, and they can always learn from what these bigger companies do. So we are going to dig into all of that. But before that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest, and that is going to be, Brian, your perspective on business growth.
Yeah, so my perspective on growth, I think, is spans a number of different perspectives itself. Personal growth, organizational growth, product growth, process growth, all of it needs to continue to nurture and mature and continue to move forward. And I think that from an organizational perspective, your team members and the folks on the front line really need to understand, if they don't already, the role that they play in making your clock go tick-tock.
Yeah.
They need to really have an opportunity to express themselves in a culture where fresh ideas are welcome, where constructive criticism is welcome, and that they're looking for opportunities to make things better. I think the biggest challenge we have with growth right now is, frankly, a little bit of change fatigue.
Yeah.
There's been so many initiatives that have been put forward, so many different dimensions in terms of how to continuously improve. That's tough for individuals that are our key users and are super users. And so we have to be mindful of that and make sure that we're including them in the change process and really practicing change leadership instead of just change management.
Don't agree more. And I guess for executives, when they look at the number of ideas and the initiatives, it's just overwhelming. And when we look at implementations as big as ERP, and when you are going to have a lot of countries involved in any of the large implementation, it could be a very frightening experience. And one of the things
For
that
sure.
you mentioned during our conversation is going to be setting the initial vision. So obviously you have a very compelling story that you would like to share. So maybe we can dig into that. But then I also want to touch on to how you sort of set the initial vision. A lot of executives, when I work with them, they really struggle, to be honest, because they are sort of at the 200,000 foot level, but that does not really connect, to be honest. Yes, from the vision
Right.
perspective, you want to be there, but you have to have enough meat in that vision so that at least it is what the ground floor is trying to do. So yeah, so two things. Maybe you want to start with the story and then touch on how you really set the vision for this project that you embarked upon.
Yeah. Okay. So the project I'm going to talk about today is very large manufacturer
Yeah.
operating in more than 30 countries with manufacturing, high technology type of manufacturing involved, as well as having more than 250,000 employees. So a massive organization, really. And what they had done over the past number of years was to take core transactional processes and put them into what we would call a shared services center, regionalized. So
Yeah.
they had them in North America, they had them in Asia, they had them in Europe, and of course, out of those different organizations, manifest a number of different variables in how the process might actually work. And some of them are statutory, of course. So we
Yeah.
need to know and make sure that we're doing things appropriately for legal reasons and compliance reasons. But then a lot of it is perhaps also cultural and bad habits from this is the way we always did it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that story is compelling to understand and listen to, because they were fixated on, from a very high level within the organization, how to make things better, how to make it more accountable, and how to make sure that they were tracking and reporting upon it. And I think one of their core tenets was, if you can't report on it, then you can't really measure the success or whether you've improved it.
Yeah.
So they spent a considerable amount of time on metrics and KPIs, and trying to make sure that they understood, really where they were at any given point in their journey along this transformation process.
Very interesting. So let's talk about the metrics and KPI. And obviously, when you are looking at this massive organization, obviously their problem is probably going to be having too many KPIs. So I don't know if they had KPIs. Was there any insight that was missing? But typically, in my experience, I think the problem always with most organizations, irrespective of whether they are small or large, is going to be the data that they have is probably not accurate. And the reason why it is not accurate is going to be because you have foundational issues. Because the way I don't know how the divisions were structured, how many different business models that they have. Typically,
right.
It is going to be, okay, I'm selling one product in US, I'm selling one product in in Europe, but the SKU that I may have is completely different. Now, because of that, the insight is going to be completely different as well, right? So, what were the core challenges from the metrics and KPI perspective, and what transformation did they really want to have in those metrics and the KPIs?
So a couple things. Touch on the regional type of approach that you were commenting on. I think we lived in this exceptionally intertwined global economy,
Yeah.
and their business is no different. They
Yeah.
would sell essentially the same widget to an Asian manufacturer as to
Yeah.
a European manufacturer. So they had maybe a better opportunity to try to standardize the business processes that were core finance capabilities.
Yeah.
The challenge that they had with KPIs specifically was that they had very manual processes.
Okay.
And when you get into finance transformation, people are, the buzzwords of automation just seem to cloud the perspective of what the objectives or the vision might be.
Yeah.
Of course, we want automation. Of course, we want to take out non-value added tasks that, that folks are doing. But that's not necessarily the core overall ROI and value of a finance transformation project, right?
Right.
There's so much more that comes with that. When you focus on automating accounts payable, and you're looking at specifically automating the capture of information from an invoice,
Yeah.
you're probably looking at one of the lower paid individuals in the business, and trying to address their employment perspective and the cost that's associated with that.
Yeah.
There's the touch points back into the business, and the folks that need to manage this information and control the process and approve invoices. Now you're talking about managers and executives, and obviously price points go up. So it's important that we focus on what is important. And over the last 25 years, the OCR vendors have done this great job of indoctrinating us into automation means OCR and eliminating that type of work.
Yeah.
And true enough, that's important. But the KPIs that these folks were trying to measure, which was really straight through process, it was dependent on having a good business process that ensured that the purchasing process was correctly adhered to. Because when you post an accounts payable invoice, it's got to reference a purchase order or a goods receipt. And all that stuff needs to fit together to make for a touchless process. And so it's not simply about the capture, right, of the data on the invoice. And I think that's where a lot of organizations get caught up is, the automation is really super easy to measure and see and understand the value. And the rest of it's more complex, but the complexity is where really the payoff is.
Yeah, could not agree more. So I don't know if you're going to have any specific examples of the KPI. So in this particular case, I understand that, everybody tries to focus on, okay, I'm going to get this paper-based invoice. I am actually going to read from it, and our life is going to be easy. But the real problem always is once you capture that data and the transaction is going to flow through your operational and financial systems, and that's where a lot of people are doing a lot of different magic and that manual magic that you were talking about, and that's where things fall through, and then finally your analytics and KPI is actually going to be off. So in this particular case, I don't know if there was a global KPI that they were trying to measure, and that did not add up to what they had at the regional level. So do you want to pick an example of the KPI and just walk us through the process of where the manual touch points were there in the KPI?
Sure. So you can fix a lot of things with having an individual entering data on an invoice, right? There's a lot of what we would call tribal knowledge that happens within the organization as these people have been long-term employees and they understand exactly how the business works.
Yeah.
The KPI that they're looking for is, what's our percentage first pass yield?
Yeah.
Meaning how many transactions are running through the system without somebody having to get involved. That's a technology application. The second piece is, okay, once it comes through, does it process automatically? There's always exceptions. Does it deal with the exceptions in an appropriate way? Does it manage the non-exceptions and post these transactions automatically? And then on top of that, what's my cycle time through all of that? Right? And so then you can really start to focus on where the cost is in the process, how to take the cost out, and how to manage across the various shared services centers. And so their example was that they had a shared services center that was much more engaged and I would say in control of their process. And they had another one that was less disciplined. And really, it was a challenge then to follow those metrics or those KPIs through because they might have more people that are attending to the transactions. So you had to measure the actual cost of the investment of the human resource pool versus the throughput as well. And so there was a number of things that you just didn't get out of the systems. That was just something that wasn't. You don't have your headcount in your ERP necessarily, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to go in and you have to go back and download this into some data lake and then start massaging the data. And so that was the primary problem they had to begin with was they didn't have consistent data. They didn't have consistent processes in place to really understand where the data may be telling a story or not. And then it was a full-time job to aggregate it and report upon it.
Out of the KPIs that you mentioned, some of them are very new to me as well, to be honest. Okay. So when you look at the percentage first pass yield, and those are, in my mind, slightly more technical KPIs than the business KPIs, which
Yeah.
are going to be cycle time. So when you are trying to measure the cycle time, then you are going to be looking at, okay, what are my dependent KPIs that are going to be affecting my cycle time? So obviously this is very important, but I don't know how many ERP systems are going to be able to provide. So did you guys create any sort of the analytical workflows through which you computed this? Because you probably need infrastructure just to compute that KPI. So how did you guys
That's
come
right.
up with these KPIs, and how did you find data for that?
So in many of these solutions that are on the marketplace today, it's a disjointed system
Yeah.
approach, right? You're
Yeah.
using one tool for doing the capture. You're handing it off then to another process or system that is doing the workflow and attempting to post. And within there, though, there's always this ability to track. And the I would say a best practice is that as this transaction moves through the process, it's got a status associated with it. So that first pass has a status. The auto post has a status, and it's date and time stamped by the system. And so you can do some simple math to say this is how long my cycle time is to move it from point A to point B. And then in addition to that, then if you're using status codes effectively, and that was part of the evolution of this project as well, if you're using them effectively, then you can get a really good sense of where the exceptions are, what types of exceptions you're dealing with on a regular basis and recurring basis, and then you focus your effort on that. Similar at a vendor or a customer perspective. If you're doing an AR project, you know which customers are presenting you with challenges and deductions in their remittance processing, and you can start to report on that and then see the pattern and the evolution of that. On the vendor side, similar. If they're sending you very difficult to read invoices, then it's time to focus on that vendor and say, hey, you need to send me a digital invoice. Or some other form of communication here because we're spending a lot of time on your invoices and it's not meeting our vendor standards. So that those KPIs, in my opinion, they aren't necessarily standard out of the box, But I think in this instance, this client did an exceptional job of understanding the data that they were looking for, how to track it, and then how to ultimately prove the value and the success of the project because of their KPIs and metrics that they were valuing.
Very interesting. So you are touching a lot on the shared services. And when you look at the SMB space, I don't know how many people really understand what shared services are, to be honest,
Yeah,
from the
sure.
business process perspective, right? So describe, okay, what is the importance of shared services? At what stage companies need to be thinking about shared services? What are the best practices of the shared service model?
So the evolution of the shared services model was really one of labor arbitrage originally, right?
Yeah,
Let's take all these transactions. So if you had 30 countries, 30 plants, you might have had an accounts payable clerk in each one of those plants
yeah,
processing invoices.
yeah.
And that didn't make sense, obviously, because then you've got a real disparate approach to the process. You've got no control and no visibility to your liabilities, things like that. So fast forward to, okay, so now we start to outsource these things to low labor cost countries and aggregating what is essentially very transactional type of processing, right? That was the simple stuff. And then it got to be that, well, okay, well, now we need to apply some business intelligence to that, right? Having somebody who really understands the process makes this go better and faster, and we can use technology with that component piece, apply some good human interface to it who understands our business, and then you've got a far superior process. So the shared services center, though, for volumes of transactions, like this organization probably runs, I don't know, somewhere 3-4 million invoices per year. So that's a lot of transaction volume, right? You want to have that centralized in a process where you've got backup, where you've got good standard leadership opportunity to make sure that the process is always adhering to your standards. I think that in the SMB business, there's maybe an opportunity to look at your processes and say, yeah, these are transactional in nature. I want to focus my efforts on something that is important to me, right? I know exactly what my cost of my human resource capital is, and these are the activities that I want them focusing on. These transactional types of things, if I can't get my process in line, then I want to outsource that and have somebody else do that for me, perhaps. And that's really the genre or the concept of the shared services was, let's take these like functions and put them all into one place and make experts out of that team to do that. I think that opportunity still exists within the small, medium-sized business. I think that what you want to do first is look at your process and make sure that the process is good. Is there value in applying technology to it? What's the investment horizon that you want to use? And if you still then want to manage that in-house, that's great. If not, there's organizations that you can outsource that work to, and you can focus on, the core business that's most important to you.
Very interesting. So when I look at this model, so obviously one option could be the outsourcing it to somebody else. But shared service could exist even internally in the organization as well. And you
For sure.
provided an example where you said that, you know what, if you have, let's say, I am doing business in 30 countries, I am doing in US, Canada, I have, let's say the Philippines, Mexico, India, Brazil in the fold. If I have those countries, obviously
Yeah.
the human resources cost is going to be slightly lower or far lower, depending upon the country you are talking about. And what you could do is you could actually outsource your shared services and the activities that are going to be slightly more transactional in nature to those countries. Now, if you do this, okay, does this change, number one, your business processes? Number two, your ERP implementation? Because the way I am visualizing this in my head is going to be, okay, AR, AP, GL, hey, Philippines, you take care of that. Because my cost is far lower. I am only going to be taking care of, I don't know, maybe, customer centric activities, maybe manufacturing if that needs to be near shore. If I'm going to
Yep.
have manufacturing, I'm shipping that to China. Now that changes the whole game. That changes the whole transaction, the way you are going to be. But that also changes your supply chain entirely, because if you're shipping, let's say, manufacturing to China, then you need to think about how my network is going to be, how you are going to be shipping your raw materials and the finished goods, and who's going to be producing what, and how you are going to be planning across the world. So when you are looking at this kind of transformation, that changes everything. Did you guys have to go through this process when you were redesigning the
Yeah, for
organization?
sure. Yeah, and I've done that many times. Absolutely, those are the conversations you have. Where are you doing business? What are you doing in those locations? What's statutory about those locations? So, for instance, Italy used to have very specific requirements, and still do, about the presentation of the invoice. Brazil and Mexico have their own requirements. China has their own requirements in terms of what needs to happen on that invoice, how that invoice needs to be processed. So while we want to get to a point where we could then take all of those transactions and go to where manufacturing is the lowest cost and processing these transactions is the lowest cost, we also still just need to make sure that we remember that we have, like, I think, distinctive processes across these different geographic regions, primarily because of statutory issues. So not everything is the same, and so we have
Yeah.
to be mindful about that. But then, absolutely, once you understand and have put the process in place, and you've got some technology that you want to run on top and integrate into your ERP, then the next step is really, okay, what's the best organizational structure to manage this?
So very interesting. So let's go back to the story, right? Because in this story, so what were their core transformational challenges? So you touched a little bit that, okay, their KPIs were missing. They wanted to have, a little bit more automation. And so that's typically the underlying reason. But what else did you guys find the opportunity that actually was the trigger for this massive rollout that now we need to change the entire ERP for 30 countries? So what were the
Sure.
underlying pain and the reasons?
So it's typically boils down to, I would like to say, three different things.
Okay.
The first is cash flow.
Okay.
And so that cash flow, you need to be in control of that cash. You need to know when that cash is coming due. You need to know exactly what your liabilities are, and you need to ensure that you're in control of when you pay that out. Right?
Yeah.
You want to process that invoice as quickly as possible, so that if somebody offers you a cash discount term, that you can take it.
Yeah.
If you've got a manual process and it takes 12, 14, 16 days to put an invoice into the system, guess what? You can't take those cash discounts anymore.
Right.
And so you're costing your organization money by that. Second piece is really the expense or the cost associated with the process.
Yeah.
In this instance, you're processing multiple millions of invoices per year, and you're having somebody manually do that, and maybe there's expertise, maybe there isn't. That's a high cost of personnel investment. And so then there's definitely a value in automating that part and making sure that the capture piece and the non-value added type of data entry goes away. And I would also say the generation of KPIs should become automated as well, right? So that you understand, and this becomes a much more fluid type of a process. And the third is really about risk. And when you've got a multitude of transactions that are being entered into a system manually, across different regional areas with different varying standards, you have a significant amount of risk to that part of the business process. And I can remember that with another large multinational manufacturer in the automotive space that I worked with,
Yeah.
they that's a just-in-time inventory process, and similar to this one as well. When you're supplying a core piece of manufacturing componentry, and there's another manufacturing facility depending upon its timely arrival, you better make sure that you have paid your bills, and you don't want to be cut off by somebody and all of a sudden you can't make things work. And so this other manufacturer had that exact issue. Nothing was strategic about accounts payable until the electric bills weren't being paid and the plants were being shut down. And all of a sudden, the chairman or the CEO gets involved, and this becomes a very strategic process now. And so those three things of cash flow, the cost of the process and the cost of the organization, and the risk inherent in the process are what drives typically at least 90% of the projects that I see. Some of them are personal kind of things that people get involved in, but those are the core things. That's what every single CFO understands, and understands the value of these projects in transforming their business, and what the drivers are. And in this instance, no different. All three of those played a role because of the manual nature, the high volume of the transactions, the sensitivity of supplying their own customers with product and making sure that there was no interruption in their supply chain.
Very cool. So vendor discounts, right? That's always a tricky process. And obviously,
Right.
as the finance guy, as the CFO, I would like to capitalize on every single discount. But when you are working with a very large global organization, if you really want to capitalize on vendor discount, what you need to have is, let's say, if you're working with a vendor, and that could very well be applicable in the customer side of processes as well. So basically, let's say if
Sure.
I am dealing with, I don't know, maybe my supplier is 3M or Rockwell Automation, okay, and I am dealing with them. Now, the ideal scenario, if I really want to get all the discounts that I can possibly get from Rockwell, then I need to have very large corporate contract at the HQ level, and then they are going to be supplying to everybody, whoever is buying, and then I have just one massive contract so that I have far more negotiation power because I'm buying that much from Rockwell, and obviously I'm going to get their attention overall. Now, to do that is a massive lift. Okay, you literally need a hero, to bring all of these entities in one fold, and then you need to convince them that okay, we need to have one vendor master or the customer master that everybody should be using, okay, across the ERP, because that is going to slow
Sure.
everybody down because you need to have the
Yeah.
governance process in terms of how the customers and vendors are added inside your systems. It seems like a very technical problem, but it's very, very, very political problem, to be honest. Okay, and managing
Right.
that requires a lot of firepower. So, in your experience, let's say if you are going through this process, have you come across this? Were you successfully able to manage, this change? And if you did it, how did you do it?
Yeah. Okay. So just to touch very briefly on the vendor discount, first of all, before you start soliciting and asking for those discounts from, your vendors, you better be in a position to know that you can actually take them. And so a lot of organizations say, "Yeah, I want the discount. I want the discount," and then it's their day 20 on a 10-day discount payment term, and they still take the discount. Well, that just creates a lot of ill will with the vendor community, and so you don't want that. But back to the real issue of how to get these projects moving forward and the value and the ROI, I think is maybe where this is going as well. The cash discount can play a significant role in an accounts payable return on investment analysis. And if you choose, I've created models in the past where I allowed them to see what that value could be by looking at their transaction flow and what they've taken, what they've left on the table based on terms that they had, and then ultimately, what we would project that value would be moving forward. And then we give them the option of including that or excluding that from their ROI analysis. And you can pay for a project based on cash discount terms. So that is definitely an important consideration that needs to be raised early on when we talk about visioning. What are the drivers of the project? You touched on that as well. What's motivating these organizations to go through this, and then how do we take that message and make sure that everybody understands it? And of course, central to all of this is you have to have a foundational layer of master data that is, rock star quality. I think that outside of that, you're really going to struggle. And I've dealt with multitudes of organizations that have grown inorganically. They've got, 3, 4, 5 different ERPs that they're running, and they're trying to harmonize these at some point. And that master data initiative can be very significant. I think even in the SMB world, you probably could go to your vendor files today and look and see how many different FedEx accounts you have, for instance, right? If you got 10, 12, 14 different FedEx accounts or addresses, you're not going to automate that process because you're going to get a FedEx invoice and it's going to say, well, I don't know what vendor to put this to. And so I just see that there's that problem, and that challenge is endemic across every organization. And the ones that get it right and really take the initiative to clean that up and make it effective have much greater returns on their project portfolio.
Yeah, so let's talk about that process a little bit in terms of the workflow. So let's say if companies, sure, now they sort of understand the problem that, even if I'm the SMB organization, probably I'm using 2 ERP, even the SMB organization, they use multiple ERPs just because they might have legacy one, they acquired something for distribution, then they are doing a little bit of manufacturing. The distribution cannot do manufacturing, so now they have 2 different ERP systems, even though you might not have 2 different legal divisions, to be honest. Okay, you
Right.
may still have that, right?
Yep.
Now, when you are trying to streamline, let's say, the master data to capitalize on cash discount, vendor discount, obviously this process is trickier than anybody can perceive how difficult that is, to be honest. Okay, so obviously you need to have the governance process. That is number one. But even if you have the guidelines and the governance process, execution is always going to be tricky. And I think you did mention in your example that one of the division in your story was not as high disciplined, and when they are not as high disciplined, meaning they have a room to play with the guidelines that the corporate is trying to send, and they are finding their own ways because there is a loophole in the guidelines, and they might be able to capitalize. So let's say if you were to set a governance framework for a company around master data, what would be your recommendation? How to start on this process and how to make sure that it actually gets executed to come up with the ideal master data framework that you are trying to propose?
I don't think I've seen a single master data project get approved standalone.
Okay.
And so what you have to do then is understand that obviously we're not going to eat this elephant all at one sitting, right? And so we're going to have to like chunk it up into different projects.
Okay.
And then I think that there's an expectation management issue here. You have to be really realistic in terms of how you go about managing this. And it goes back to what's the vision? What's the vision for the project? And if master data cleanup and trying to harmonize master data across systems, for instance, is part of it, okay, make sure that there's value in the budget or in the project timeline for that to happen. What I see happen is they want to manage some of that through the testing process. They get into testing and realize, okay, we got some issues, but we got to keep going because we got to hit the timeline.
Yeah.
And then it becomes we'll fix it afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Once we're live, we'll take care of all this stuff. And like you said, I think you use the word magic, right?
Yeah.
So they think that this is where all the magic happens, and then all the master data is great. But it just doesn't happen like that. And so the reality, especially for mature organizations that have grown inorganically and have got these multiple ERPs, you just have to be realistic that there's a component piece that we need to set aside in terms of time, in terms of money, maybe in terms of an additional tool to help facilitate that process, and then we have to be really disciplined about how we want to look at that. And it's not sexy. That topic isn't exciting for anybody, but what it does is it does pay dividends down the road in terms of being able to really improve upon the processes of essentially the near cash processes that are so critical.
Very interesting. So when you are working with these large projects, what is your recommendation typically when, let's say, you are rolling out in 30 countries? Everybody has their own approaches in terms of how they like to roll this out. But obviously, one thing that you don't want to do is, okay, I go live in 30 countries overnight, and we are all going to have a very happy life.
Yeah. Yeah, that is not. Those two are incongruent. I think that when I think about just the master data alone, for instance, let's look at an accounts payable project, and one of the KPIs they had was how effective are we at managing these straight through processes and making sure that the invoices are paid on a timely basis at a vendor level. And so you've got some massive vendors, right? You've got this 80-20 rule. 20% of your vendors probably represent 80% of your dollar value, if not invoice volume. So focus on those first. And so that's one way to address this. Get in there and look at the analysis of what the vendor spend is or what the customer remittance process is, and focus on those that are most critical. And then make those as effective as you can. And that's exactly what they did here. They went back and said to some of them, because this was using a new technology as well that was basically receiving digital data in a different manner than what had been happening before. And so they went back to some of the vendors and said, we need to have a different invoice file come from you. This is what it needs to look like. Well, you can't do that with 50, 60,000 vendors, but you can do it with 100 vendors or 200 vendors. And that made a significant difference in their KPIs by bringing those organizations along. And they could see it because they were tracking it at a vendor level basis.
Interesting. So was that the qualifier for the countries to select when you rolled out in 30 different countries? Yeah. So I don't know if this was really an ERP project, to be honest. I mean, that's what. No. So what is the process for rollout?
So it's not ERP, but it was touching all aspects of this core finance process that was procure to pay. And what I would say is that they had a different impression of how they would roll this out originally. And as they got into it, they realized, oh, we've got some challenges in this particular shared services center. So let's look at, a win on this other one here, that we can control better, that we understand the business better, that's got a more simplified, I think it was a simplified vendor grouping. But they had vendors that were across similar vendors or same vendors that were across all of these shared services centers, right? And so they still needed to make this work for the vendor perspective as well. But they did go back and say this a global rollout, big bang isn't going to happen. So we need to stagger this. We need to get this process, and it was process as well as technology, corrected first. Then we can go back and bring the others on board. And it was a much more rapid deployment than probably what we would have expected, given that they had put that much more effort into the first go live.
Okay, amazing. So that's it for today. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
What I would say is understand, what the vision is about, what the drivers are of the project, what's the ROI, what's the senior leadership looking for, and can you measure it? And if you can measure it, then get ahead of this thing. Start your change leadership and change management early, communicate often, and talk in terms of cost, cash, risk that people want to hear. They want to understand the value that they're contributing to the organization. And then that change fatigue we talked about and some of the challenges. You will always have challenges in these projects, but you keep your eye on the ball and keep moving forward as a team, even with your vendor group, and I mean the vendor that's supplying the solution, perhaps, and your internal teams, and they can be successful, and they can be rewarding, and they can be fun to be on, and they can pay a dividend.
Amazing. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be that finance is not the department that people typically think that there could be any opportunities or the transformation. But if you go back to your basics in terms of capitalizing discounts, in terms of how the finance processes are done, there are significant opportunities just from the cost saving perspective. On that note,
Sure.
Brian, I want to thank you for your time. This has been a powerful episode.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Pleasure.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Brian, head over to gain.com. It's GEIGN.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Sue Shaw, who shares her insights into how to succeed with large global rollouts for the oil and gas industry. Also, the interview with Bob Feathers, who shares his insights and lesson learned from a multi-site ERP implementation. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.